Welcome back to part 2 of Eric's V8 install. This video we're going to be tapping the side of the transmission to accept the cooler line fittings using the jig from Jeep Speed Shop. I'll show the removal and installation of the TCM and the valve body, and then I'm going to go over the specifics of installing the transmission. The next video will include the ECM and the TCM wiring harness. So we got our 8HP70 here. This is the factory oil cooler. Before you take this off, you can take off these actual fittings here. These are for the oil lines. We'll take off this whole bracket and then we will tap the actual sides of the transmission. Take off this neutral parking lever because you don't need that anymore. And again, save these fittings, and if your transmission did not come with these fittings, you will need to purchase them if you plan on using factory oil cooler lines. And then you can remove this external oil heater because you won't be using this anymore. So we got the jig set here from Jeep Speed Shop. It came with these 3 studs, so install them into the transmission and then you can slide on this bracket. Put the tap in just a little bit, that way it lines up, and then we'll put the actual nuts on these studs. And before putting on the jig, we do have this ream here. We don't have a drill bit that's big enough to run this, so by hand we were able to spin it and just ream it out a little bit. Jeep Speed Shop did send these little red caps to make sure no metal shavings get inside the transmission, so make sure to put those in before you start tapping. And make sure your tap stays well oiled. Once you've got a good amount of threads into the transmission, you can take it all the way out. You can take the jig off. Make sure you take the tap out before you unbolt the jig. And then you can finish the tap with the jig off of the transmission. Alright, you can see here how far in we take the tap. This top hole we still need to go further in. Then we'll clean out the threads, and then we can use some thread sealant and put these fittings in there. Alright, once you feel it start to get real tight, that is as far as you want to go. Now that we got this fittings tapped, we're going to take off the oil pan, and then we're going to remove the valve body and take off the TCM. There's going to be 13 oil pan bolts, and those use a T40 Torx bit. These bolts can also get used in the steel oil pan, and I will also put all the torque specs in the video description. Here is the valve body. I'm going to post a picture marking each bolt that needs to get removed. There's going to be 18 T40 bolts that are going to be holding down the valve body and the speed sensor. And don't forget to take off your plug. You need to take off this bolt first, and then you lift up this piece. And this should wiggle out. The best way that I found to take this guy out, grab some little pliers and you can kind of pry on the edge a little bit. But again, make sure that this piece is pulled up first. Make sure you do this bolt and lift this piece up. We're just breaking all of these loose. This transmission has a little bit higher mileage. We are referencing the photo from my last 8HP70 video. And be careful of that speed sensor. This comes straight out. It's fine, it's good. Make sure when you put the TCM back in, this piece has to be sticking straight up. To activate this piece to go straight up, push down right there. So push down right there for me. And then now I can flip this up. And that goes straight up like that. So you need a second hand. Or you can activate it and put a wrench on the outside where the shift lever was at. And that will hold it up for you so you can install the TCM alone. And now we need to take off the actual TCM off of the valve body. These are the bolts you need to remove to separate the TCM from the valve body. And the reason we're removing the TCM is so that we can send it to Jeep Speed Shop and they can upload a Challenger tune. That way tap shift will work. But Jeep Speed Shop recommends first testing out the transmission, installing it, driving it, make sure it works, and then removing everything and sending it to them. And after removing the bolts, you can remove this plug first, and then you can separate the TCM from the valve body. And then it should just come disconnected. It's going to be a little difficult coming off of the solenoids on the back, but it will separate from there. Alright, and this is the actual part that gets sent to Jeep Speed Shop. That way they can flash it for tap shifting. And then keep your valve body in a safe and clean spot. That way when you get this back from Jeep Speed Shop, you can put it all back together and put it in the transmission. Alright, we've got our TCM that was sent back from Jeep Speed Shop after it's been flashed. That way your tap shift can work. They flash it with a Challenger tune. So now we can put this on the actual valve body. I'm going to make sure that it gets clipped in nicely to all these solenoids. So you can gently put it on here. And you'll feel it kind of clip into the solenoids here. Alright, and then it is going to be 5 T27 bolts, and these are the smaller ones that go into the actual TCM. And I'll post a picture of these bolts also. Make sure you're extra careful with this speed sensor so you don't break it. A lot of these tips get broken off.
Okay. The automatic, even if it's Rubicon or whatever, it's not the actual bracket. So,
alright, ready? And then you can bring this plug around and plug it back in. Now we can put this whole valve body assembly back into the transmission. On the bottom of the valve body, there's this spring that will prevent it from laying flat automatically, but once you start to put some bolts in it, it will lay flat. And make sure you still have this O-ring on the bottom of the valve body. Just this piece. Okay. And make sure it's nice and flat when you're pushing it down. Make sure this goes inside here. You got to pull this little lever and this goes inside this. Alright, and then also your speed sensor, you want to make sure it's all the way seated down before you try to put the bolts in there and tighten it down, or else you'll end up breaking it. So make sure it's seated all the way down, and then you can tighten up the bolt. There's a total of 18 T40 bolts, including these 3 here. So tighten it down first, and then we'll put the plug in. And here's the torquing sequence to torquing down the valve body. Make sure before you do bolt number 16, you put the plug in.
Oh, right there. There it goes.
Just goes in just like that.
And then it locks down.
And then we get to push that lock down. And then you put the bolt in there. And here's the torquing sequence for the oil pan. Should be the same for the plastic and the metal pan. Or at least it should be similar for the metal pan. Here's the part number for the oil pan. Alright, so now we're getting ready to install the transmission, but we got to do a couple things first. I recommend making sure that the torque converter is all the way seated. Usually you got to spin it around 3-4 times both directions. That way you know it's all the way seated. The next thing we need to do is clearance out the actual adapter here for the shift lever. So we'll have to cut here, cut it at an angle, so kind of cut all this off. So this will slide right in there. So we'll do that next. And then also, this is the breather hose. This gets really close to the body. So we had to hit the body up with a hammer. That way this doesn't touch the body. then we're going to take a little bit off this bracket here. Now we can install the transfer case. And don't forget to add the shift bracket before you start putting on the nuts. And use blue Loctite. In the video description, I will put information on which transfer cases will work and which year transmissions will work. So now you can install the transmission. From sources online, the Bellhousing bolts get torqued down to 41 foot-pounds or all the way to 50 foot-pounds. Different sources had different specs. And don't make the same mistake that I did. Make sure you install the intermediate plate first. And here's the part number for that intermediate plate. Alright, we are tightening the top Bellhousing bolts. A little easier from the top to tighten these. 41 foot-pounds. And we'll go tighten the bottom ones. So now you can tighten the torque converter to the flex plate, and these get torqued down to 31 foot-pounds using red Loctite. Alright. You should be able to spin the torque converter around freely, and then you can pull it forward towards the front of the Jeep to line up the bolt holes. Alright, don't forget to use red Loctite, and you want to make sure you get them all hand started before you torque any of them down. So then you can have Eric spin the motor.
You need that?
What's that? No, that's just turning it on. Okay, kind of hold it for me.
Yep, hold it.
So next is the structural dust cover. This has a very specific torquing sequence, and I will post it right now. What this is telling you to do is tighten the dust cover to the transmission to 9 Newton meters, and then tighten the dust cover to the engine to 9 Newton meters, and then do the bolts again to the transmission to 54 Newton meters, and then to the engine to 54 Newton meters. And here is the part number for this structural dust cover. So now we can install the starter, and that will be 40 foot-pounds. Alright, we're going to cut a little bit off of this transmission adapter bracket. Gets a little close, doesn't touch, but gets a little close. And here's the part number. It is on the BOM from Jeep Speed Shop. So we'll cut it off a little bit right here. This is the orientation of the B plate looking from the rear of the vehicle. And then we have the stock transmission mount that we need to grind a little bit off of so it doesn't hit the 1350 drive shaft. Alright, so we got the B plate fully bolted down. And I put these little washers here for a spacer. And you can see here we grind it away a little bit. That way there's clearance for the drive shaft. So now we can install our fittings for our oil cooler lines. And then I always use this surface prep cleaner and then high temp thread sealant. So we'll go ahead and install these into the transmission. Next we're going to do these transmission lines. These are from the 392 JL, so they do bolt up nicely. So these lines will get bolted up right here, and then they will bolt up to one of the oil pan bolts. And they're just nice and tight. Put a little spacer under that bolt there. And with the 392, the alternator's on this side. So we'll end up cutting these lines and adapting them to our oil cooler. So stay tuned to see that in the next video. And also, if you're enjoying these videos, don't forget to like and subscribe. And here are a few things to come in the next videos.
Make sure too.
Yeah,
Just like,
that is hot.